All right, guys, we got Brijesh Patel, Director of Performance at Quinnipiac, or is it Head Strength Conditioning Coach?
No, I've upgraded. I'm now an associate athletic director for athletic performance.
Well, damn, man, that's
Yeah,
awesome. That's a whole nother conversation, right? Like, I mean,
yeah.
you started with
It's just
nothing.
kind of a fancy way of saying head strength and conditioning coach, right? Yeah,
Yeah, that has
it
to sit
is.
in your meeting every once in a while.
Yeah, right. I've been here for going on 15 years now, and yeah, I started out the program from nothing. There was nobody before me, and it was just me. And then eventually, like now, I've got to the point where we have three full-time staff members too. The administration has, you know, invested in me, and they thought highly enough of me to make me an associate athletic director, which puts me in some different meetings and different conversations. But in reality, like my job is still the same. It's to help the student athletes become the best versions of themselves and to try to help them perform.
Yeah, man, I think that's another thing to, kind of maybe have another conversation for another time. But this talk about how do you get more? Well, your athletic department tells you exactly how they think about you every single day by what they're willing to give you, and you got to go out there and earn it, and you got to go out there and prove it, and you got to go out there and sell what you're doing. Especially if, I can imagine what that first weight room looked like when you walked in there. It was probably not much, and now to see what you got now, and you have multiple weight rooms and multiple staff members, and it takes time, but man, once you actually show that you can sell your program and sell the value of what you're doing to for student athletes and the overall athletic department, like, and granted too, the other aspect, it's, hockey's a big deal there, man, and you got some programs that are really good, and that, it just so happens when you got there, things started going up and to the right, so really cool, man. So today we're going to talk a lot about fascia, tensegrity, anatomy trains, a lot of different areas we can go into, and we've gotten pretty in the weeds in the actual module on this one, going through this idea of compressional discontinuity, just a fancy way of like almost joint by joint, maintaining space within the joints, controlling fascial lines, thinking about compression and tension to move freely and being like a good athlete, so to speak. But I want to open this up to you. You know, where are you at right now when you think about fascia? We can go into self myofascial release, we can go into anatomy lines, we can go into just mobility, flexibility, we can go into just your programming. But where are you at now with fascia, comparatively speaking, to maybe the first time you heard about this 15, 20 years ago? Like, what was the progression and where are you at now with you and training your athletes?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's there's many stages to that. Like I first heard about fascia in 2005, and I sat down for Mike Boyle's Functional Strength Coach 1. And I was an assistant at Holy Cross at that time, and I thought I knew a lot. And here, Mike was a mentor of mine, a friend of mine, and he's talking about anatomy trains and foam rolling the bottom of your feet, and I was blown away. I was like, this guy has accomplished so much, but yet he continues to push the boundaries of what's out there and what he can learn to try to help his clientele the best that he can. And I heard about fascia throughout the years, and it wasn't until I think 2018, maybe end of 2017, that I started to realize, you know what, I'm just going to take a deep dive. And I think that's how I best learn, is when I really take a deep dive. And the things that kind of were the catalyst to it were my exposure to RPR, my exposure to PRI, and started to see the commonalities between the two systems, because they are systems, right? Um, but they are systems in an effort to try to improve nervous system function, and in turn to try to improve your joint function and motor potential. So I started to see the commonalities, and I started to realize that fascia was a cornerstone of both. And then so I started to read anatomy trains first. That was my first book, and then I started to talk to a lot of other colleagues and friends, and one of them was big into Tai Chi, and he told me to read The Iron Shirt by Mantak Chia, and he started to talk about Qigong. And then when I started to look at the book, there were so many things that I hadn't realized that the Chinese knew about fascia long before Western culture did. And it was really interesting to hear them talk about fascia and how essentially the body is interconnected. And they just looked at things from a holistic perspective, whereas we in the West tend to look at things from a reductionist perspective, and we kind of break things down into different parts and segments. When in reality, when I learned about RPR, PRI, Even Gary Gray, like Gray Cook stuff, like it's the kinetic chain. And I had always looked at things from that lens, from my experiences of working with other coaches and under different people. But I think when I started to dig a deep dive down this rabbit hole, things started to get a little bit more connected. And then I started to look into Stretch to Win by the Fredericks, and I started to look into the stecco-fascial manipulation method by Dr. Warren Hammer. And I'm not a physical therapist. Like I can't put my hands on people, but for me as a coach, the more exposure that I have to physical therapy, athletic training, the better understanding that I have of injuries, movement dysfunctions, and then how training and how we can manipulate training, sequencing, and all these different variables to try to improve an athlete's ability to move much more freely. And I think that's a cornerstone of my philosophy when it comes to strength conditioning. It's not about getting somebody as strong as they humanly can, or getting just somebody as fast as they humanly can. Uh, the essence of what I do, it's based on movement, right? Like our job is to enhance an athlete's ability to move more effectively, and we use exercise to enhance movement. But the key thing to understand about if you want to really try to improve movement is that it requires this delicate balance of mobility and stability, and our ability to get into positions is going to be a prerequisite to be able to apply the maximum amount of force that we can to redirect force and move throughout our environment. And I've learned that fascia is it's an obstacle to our position, meaning that you could switch, you can use the different term posture for position, but in reality, like if we don't have the ability to get in these right positions to reduce force, then we're not going to be able to right positions to be able to produce force. And if fascia is an underlying obstacle to that, then we can beat our heads against the wall, but we're not going to be able to get in those right positions. We're not going to be able to optimize our movement. So that's where fascia really started to create a little bit more clarity in how best I can try to help my athletes move a little bit more effectively. Does that kind of make sense so far?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very like good breakdown. And one of the things I always want to talk to about the listeners of like never ask a coach about what to read because you just laid out three books right there in that discussion. Just listen, right? Like, all right, Anatomy Trains, Iron Shirt, and then there was one more book in there, Fashion Manipulation by Hammer, right? Like this.
Yeah, well, it's Luigi Stecco, but I learned about it through Warren Hammer, who actually is in Connecticut. So when you
Oh.
come back out in Connecticut, I can introduce you to him. He's a fascial legend.
Well, but it goes into this other idea though of now we get into this like threshold as a strength coach who has a limited scope, right? Like in theory, we're not allowed to put hands on, right? We can't manipulate tissue in any way because we're not licensed in that way. Which it's ironic because pretty much everything we read is all based off that central tenet of like we even go back as like Charlie Francis, like it was all based off of manipulating tissue. And then if you go to Altus, like all they're talking about is go through a moon prep and see where they're tight and start to release. And it's like I can't do any of that. I have no hands-on ability within the scope or legal like structure.
Licensure, yeah.
Yeah, and it becomes this like interesting thought experiment off of can I replicate that with self myofascial release? Can I replicate that with just really good programming, right? Do I have really structural balance program and create this appropriate length tension relationship, this stability and mobility on either side of the joint, create adequate spacing? What is your go-to? Like, so you work with professional athletes, maybe have more disposable income, and then you have that conversation of like I'm hitting this brick wall, or I work with this other group of athletes that I have to control a lot. I have to work with an ATC, maybe a physical therapist that works with the team. What is this like now, like almost this like dichotomy when we think about like your setup, right? The high performance model, like what Exos is like trying to like push us towards the dream of like, oh, they're tight, just send them to the physical therapist and
Yeah,
massage
yeah, yeah,
therapist,
yeah.
like this like yeah, great on paper, awful when you're actually boots on the ground and you're like you got 100 athletes in front of you and they're all tight and they're all restricted and they all feel like shit all the time and you're like, yeah, we're gonna train hard today, guys, and we're gonna push hard. And if you have something we need to modify, I'm gonna modify as we need to. But how are you with that, like knowing in this 10 foot, 1,000 foot level of like, hey, I can really cut to the chase here and make some great headway with tissue manipulation. However, my scope and then the constraints of my job, really limit that, and then potentially having the other end of some professional hockey players that might come through on a pretty frequent basis that might have that ability or that disposable income to do that. Like, how do you navigate that yourself?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. And what's interesting when you talked about like typically we think about manipulating tissue with hands-on work. But another way to look at things, because I'm a big perspective guy, like it's if you just shift your perspective, you can see things from a different angle. It gives you a different lens. But whenever we load somebody, we're manipulating tissue. You know what I mean? If we decide to do plyometrics, we do speed training, we do heavy resistance training, we're manipulating tissue, whether we know it or not. And by manipulating tissue, the main objective of manipulating tissue is to change the tone, right? Or change the state of a tissue. And the reason why you would want to do that is because it can improve your ability to move more freely, and it can improve your ability to get into position. So kind of like what we talked about before. So by me being exposed to RPR, PRI, some fascia manipulation, it's kind of given me this different perspective and in figuring out different ways at which we can do our resistance training exercises um, to be able to improve our positioning. And so, I'll talk about this. Like, so when I started taking some PRI courses, I looked at everything from that lens and thinking about different exercises that we had to do to be able to restore an athlete's pelvis, the ability of their pelvis to move through internal external rotation and be able to get into every single hip. Um, and we would do these remedial physical therapy, maybe rehabby type exercises if you ever been exposed to PRI. And I started to realize that, you know what, like this athletes don't always want to do this because it makes them feel like there's a reason why athletes like the weight room more than they like the training room, right? It's because they feel like they're actually an athlete. They don't feel like a patient. And so doing some of these exercises definitely helped an athlete feel better and improve their positioning. But all I did was it gave us a window of opportunity to set us up for whatever it is that we're going to do next. And when I started to look at fascia, what started to happen is I started to understand how to sequence things a little bit more effectively or pair exercises together a little bit more effectively that I can improve somebody's posture position. For example, if I knew somebody's overhead ability to get overhead was restricted, we started to come up with a little series of exercises. We would do like a dumbbell pullover on a bench. Number one, so we would use gravity to assist us with a little bit of load. Then we would go into a push up. So now we have to resist and we have to push against it, but we'd go on a box. So we'd have to go in between the box. And then we'd finish by doing some incline Ys. And we would do those sequence of 3 exercises. And the athletes would be like, wow, my shoulders feel unreal right now. And so we just manipulate their tissue to allow them to be able to get their arms overhead, but also inhibit any inhibit their pecs to a degree, also activate their lower traps and their posterior chain and their upper back, to allow them to get in better positions to whatever it is that we were going to do next, whether it be throwing med balls or pressing, pulling, whatever it may be. It just got us in a better position. Other things that we've learned by doing some direct calf work before we start to squat. And it could be some mobility, stability work there too, but just really going through a full range of motion of ankle plantar flexion and dorsiflexion has done wonders to try to improve somebody's ability to squat. So it's not the same as if I put you down on a table and manipulated some tissues around your ankle or around your pecs. We just used load and we used gravity and we used our environment and the tools that we had at our disposal to alter and change fascia. And then you could always say, well, B, how do you know that you're manipulating fascia? I don't really know. Like that's one of those things like, can you really isolate out fascia? No, I don't think you do. Because anytime you exercise or anytime you move, you're gonna load muscles, you're gonna load connective tissue, you're gonna load your fascia, you're gonna load bone, you're gonna load everything. But I have realized that there's different cues that we can use that can impact our fascia just a little bit more. So really trying to understand how kinetic chains work and anatomy trains work in this concept of how we are this single interconnected web of collagen, you know what I mean, that surrounds and binds everything. Like I'm sure you've talked about before, like a tensegrity model kind of holds everything together. If I move one joint, I'm going to tension another joint within my body, and getting this concept of understanding how to reach and how to fully lengthen and put tension on the whole chain as we stretch and as we move and as we load has done wonders for improving people's mobility. Like that is clearly evident in our athletes and the way they feel. And it's very qualitative, right? It's we're not getting people out with a put them on a table and using a goniometer. It is very qualitative in how they describe how they feel and how they move, but also I can see it. I can see that they have a little bit more stability. I can see that they have that they're a little bit more free, that they're a little bit more fluid, that they look a little bit more athletic. So that's how we've been able to use our environment and my skill set and my scope to be able to truly impact an athlete's fascia.
You know, one of the things I'm thinking about, and I'm sure you've read Supple Leopard, was this idea where Starrett essentially just reverse engineered these like consistent CrossFit movements, which when you got to that like finale, it was like kind of felt deflating, right? Like I don't give a shit about kipping pull-ups. Like I don't care. What can they do with a strict chin up? Like that was like would have been a much better outlet. But it did make you think about, can you reverse engineer a movement by like compartmentalizing a joint? Like, all right, we're going to work ankle mobility, or we're going to work hip or pelvic control and thorax control to improve this back squat position, or to improve the ability to back squat with a more vertical torso and getting below parallel, etc. And when you start to like look too of like, all right, am I funneling everything into these like correlate exercises, or these predetermined, maybe my own personal preference based exercises, or are you thinking about it from a more global, or like, I guess, transitioning to hockey or basketball or even track and field, like this more open environment, this more multivariate environment? Like, how do you triangulate that? Like, how do you answer that like process of like, yeah, I need them to be good on the ice, but before I get there, I need to be able to squat without pain or without like dysfunction. Like, how do you navigate that question? Does it start with that thing you're doing in the weight room, or is it thinking, all right, how is this manifesting into the ice or the court?
Yeah, it's an interesting question and like most answers, I think it depends, but in reality, sometimes an individual may need direct specific joint work if that's what they need to build up a weak area in their chain or um but in reality, the way we look at things is very holistic, right? So we do look at things from a movement perspective, like where are we doing stationary work? Are we doing dynamic work? Are we doing ballistic work? Are we trying to improve somebody's gait right now? Like that's what I think about if we're talking about dynamic. And then are we doing things in the sagittal plane, frontal plane, transverse plane? Like are we running, we walking, we're jogging, we're sprinting, and trying to look at movement from that perspective, but then trying to bring it backwards. So let's take, for example, hockey, right? So skating, that's their gait pattern, right? Which is very different than it would be on dry land, due to the nature of the ice, the blade, the boot that they're in. But that's their gait, right? That's what we need to be able to improve for allow them to be able to perform at a higher level, right? And so thinking about what movements are they going to need? They're going to need hip abduction, hip external rotation, hip extension. But to be able to get adequate, those three motions, then we need to get the opposite. We need to have hip internal rotation. We need to get hip adduction. We need to get hip flexion. And to be able to do those effectively, then we also need to have ankle plantar flexion or ankle dorsiflexion. So we just kind of look at things from a joint by joint perspective, but also kind of piece them all together too with a holistic perspective and understand how the trunk is going to affect that too, and being able to make sure that we can rotate. So all those types of things are really important. And then we kind of dial it back step by step by what are the things that we can do in the weight room to improve our movement that will eventually transition to improve our abilities, our athletes' ability to perform gait, right? And a lot of that comes down to like some of the things I learned in PRI. Like a lot of the things that they look at is from a perspective of gait and trying to improve somebody's ability, and that an individual's ability to reciprocally inhibit one side to the other side so that they can actually move triplanar. So it is a step-by-step process. We look at gait, then we kind of take a step backwards. And we look at what are the things in the weight room that we can try to improve from a squat, push, pull. We think about those as like stationary type movements. And then look at that from a deeper level, what things do we need to try to improve on an isolation perspective so we can try to improve their ability to perform these stationary movements, so ultimately we can try to improve their gait mechanics. So it is a we look at things holistically, but there are instances maybe somebody needs a little bit more direct shoulder work. Maybe somebody needs a little bit more direct hip mobility or hip stability worked because they're having this issue on their split squat. They're having this issue in their squat. And I know if they're having this issue in a split squat, like it may affect them when we start to run or we start to bound. And those are prerequisites that we look to do before they start skating. Does that kind of make sense? Like
Yeah.
it's holistic to a degree, but then it's also very like we can break it down piece by piece if we need to.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the issues with Gary Gray and even like what like Todd Wright's like interpretation
Yeah,
of the system. It becomes very hard to pin down
they're
what.
just like do it.
Yeah, and it's great. Like, and there's an element that we need more of that, right? These like dynamic, open, like organic. Hey, this is what I got today. Like, I mean, it's I think one of the most underrated aspects when you're watching Gary Gray and him taking someone through, he comes off as like kind of hokey and kind of like, a little corny, right? Like, oh, your hips thingamabob. Like, and then you're watching it like, and you're sitting there like Dr. Taboni and the gift stuff, like breaking it down. Like, you have no idea what Gary Gray sees. The guy is a supercomputer and he watches human gait, and he's a supercomputer when he's watching this like sequence of everted ankle
Yeah.
or heel, and then he's like, all right, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna immediately make this reflexive change, and I'm gonna load this hip. I'm gonna load that knee. I'm gonna load this thing to make that person move more efficiently.
Mm.
Not everyone has that ability. Not everyone has that like skill set. And it's nice when you go, hey, we're gonna funnel into this and we're gonna see if that was good. And we go back to the drawing board of like, yeah, no, we gotta fix some things. But I think this leads into another question of mine, because what I'm thinking about right now, and I don't know if you recall this, but I was at USC a long time ago, and it was right when we could start MRIing hips, and we started to figure out, okay, there's actually hip impingement as much as there is shoulder impingement. And I remember having the conversation with you about it, specifically with your goalies, and like, yeah, they're all got hip impingement, whether it's camber pinch or a combination.
Mm-hmm,
And we just decided wholesale to not squat them, and we just did trap bar deadlift. We
mm-hmm,
do a lot more unilateral work, especially when we're doing this single leg unsupported single leg squat to a box or a bench. Like, we see this massive valgus and we see this massive compensatory action, and you're like, all right, wholesale wise, we're gonna ditch these exercises that could be problematic, and it like clicked this whole other thing, but it goes into this like next direction of. I remember you kind of when I went back and visited you when I was in Army, like, yeah, we don't really do a lot of Olympic lifts anymore. We just do rack pulls, or we do front squat, and we do plyos and med ball
yeah,
work,
yeah.
stuff on the ohm or some stuff with the Kaiser, and that's how we train power. And it started to think about like, all right, just like you described with Mike, of like, here's this guy who's so established, like this evolution. What I guess I have a question off of that would be, sorry for the long question off of this, but at a certain point, when you refine, like, I think about when you go to like, all right, I'm going to commit to doing rack pulls instead of doing hang cleans. It's a lot quicker trajectory to being good at that, right? Like, I can get a freshman, never touched a weight in their life, like, keep your back flat, keep your chin tucked, and stand up. That's it, right? It's pretty simple. Does that allow you to get to the other things like a more frontal plane squat or a more transverse plane squat? Like, do you think now, like, you've opened up now your potential from your programming or exercise selection to go faster to a lateral squat or a posterior lateral squat or a lateral lunge? Does that give you more opportunity to use different implements like a Gary Gray would, like a med ball or a
Mm.
Kaiser, or even like a flywheel to go, hey, I can go in these directions quicker, faster, and not be limited or constrained by, God dang, we got to go high hang, top of the knee,
Mm.
we got to go below knee, we got to go to the floor, and that just is like that's our power. Like, did you find that like, holy shit, I got a lot more open endedness to this and a lot more opportunity, and did that allow you to explore these different triplanar motions and different tweaks, as Gary Gray would call it, based
A
off of
hundred,
that, like, change in
yeah,
program philosophy?
100%. And it's interesting you talk about like about Gary Gray. Like I was fortunate to be at the University of Connecticut when Dave Tiberio was there, and Dave Tiberio was Gary Gray's right hand man. They would teach courses together, and I had a really good friend who was a physical therapist, John Paloff, who now works with Mike Boyle. He went to school at UConn and learned under Tiberio and learned gait, and he understand. He would try to teach me about assessing somebody's gait and trying to see what happened with their ankle. And I remember um, Dave Tiberio would always call himself, he'd be a hip guy, and Gary would always be a foot guy. And that's the way that their minds worked in trying to figure out how to create a better pattern of movement, whether they figure out to take their arms out, take their hips out, take their ankle out. And I just remembered that they would use different drivers. And if you start to take a step back, the methods that they use, that other coaches use, that fall under that embrace that philosophy, if you peel everything back, they're trying to improve somebody's movement, right? If you look at the Altus guys and you look at Charlie Francis people like Derek Hansen, like the way they train is to try to improve their athletes' ability to move, maybe at a higher velocity, but like that's what they're trying to do. Somebody who espouses Olympic lifting, powerlifting, I don't know unless I ask them if that's their philosophy, if that's their end goal is to help an athlete's ability to move. So when I decided to take out Olympic lifting within our program, it did. It opened up a lot of different avenues because I think it created more clarity in terms of what it is that I wanted to be able to do within the weight room. It allowed me to look at the weight room as a weight room. You go in a weight room to get strong. Like that's what the weight room is for. Now, I started to look at then now what is the purpose of strength? So in my eyes, strength is helps us to produce force, right? It allows us to produce. Why do we need to produce force? We need to produce force because it allows us to be able to move and manipulate our bodies throughout our environment and be able to move in whichever direction we want to, whether it be forward, laterally, three-dimensionally, transverse plane. Like if you start to think about things that way, it started to get myself to understand plyometrics just a little bit more. Plyometrics were just redirecting force, at a higher velocity. Strength training, squatting, we're redirecting force, in the vertical plane. Split squats, and now you can use different positions. You can use ramps, you can use slant boards, you can use different implements. And all you're trying to do is you're enhancing their movement, but you're just getting them to understand how to redirect force using their whole body together. Same thing, like if we teach a bench press and we bench press all the time, we want to get them to understand how to use their feet, right? Not to just create an arch like through their back, but get them to understand how do I sequence my feet, my knees, my hips, my upper body all together in an effort to produce force against the ground, to move the bar, right? It's me moving my body against the bar. That's the way we kind of look at things. And it changed my perspective and how we look at strength training, but how we look at the weight room. But if you look at the way sports has kind of evolved too, and I don't work with football and I haven't worked with football in years, but the sports that I work with specifically are highly skill-based sports where you don't always have to be the biggest, you don't always have to be the fastest, you don't always need to be the strongest. If your skill set is elite, you can be a high-level player, even though your physical capacity may not be that great. So I started to look at things from a different perspective and say, all right, if I can help an athlete perform their skills harder, faster, and longer, improve their capacity, improve their ability to produce force and reduce force. That's going to help them stay a little bit more healthy, and that's going to improve their ability to be available for our coaches to be able to use them. And so that's the way it kind of shifted perspective. Instead of looking things like, oh, we have to Olympic lift. If you think about it that way, then you're pigeonholed, right? Like you've got a tunnel vision, and just like you outlined, that's a great progression to get somebody to understand how to clean. But what is the point of doing an Olympic lift? What is the point? What is the objective of doing that exercise? And if you ask a lot of people, they're going to say, well, it's to improve rate of force development. Okay. All research shows that Olympic lifters on average have highest recorded vertical jumps, but I'm going to argue they don't have to do anything else. They don't have to change direction. They don't have to have a high aerobic capacity. They don't need to sprint. They don't need to change direction. They don't need to repeat specific skills. From an athlete's perspective, especially when you work with a skill-based sport, they need energy to perform their skills. They need energy to perform their tactical work. They need energy for cardiovascular work, all these other things. So when I was able to take out Olympic lifting, it allowed me to emphasize movement that much more. And then when we break down progressions and regressions, now we can start from a standpoint of understanding, all right, we're going to do this movement first because it allows us to sense and feel your body. Because if we can sense and feel, then we can control and change. And that's what we're really looking at. And then even like now layering on top of a greater understanding of fascia and understanding positioning, it's even more important to get our athletes to understand, like, can you sense and feel your body in these positions? And can you sense and feel them so that when we ask you to do something static and then we're going to progress it to doing something dynamic, can you feel those same positions? And then eventually if you do it frequently enough, it starts to become a habit. You don't have to think about it now. And now we can start to do ballistic things. And I can see that you're going to be in the middle of your foot. I can see that you're going to extend and push the ground away. I can see that you're going to have stability, and control in the right positions. So yes, to answer your question, I don't know if I did, but taking out one movement or one grouping of exercise, a sport in and of itself, has allowed me to open up my menu, but also open up the potential of improving our athletes' ability to move that much more effectively. And it does. Like we can use any implement that we have. We can use barbells, we can use dumbbells, we can use kettlebells, we can use medicine balls, we can use a Kaiser, we can use an ohm, which I'd love to talk to you about too, because I think it does kind of play into this part of impacting fascia. Flywheels, like the bands, like there's so many different things that we can use to load movement to try to improve their ability to perform that movement much more effectively and efficiently and repetitively.
So my follow-up question to that, and we can go into Ohm or isokinetic stuff, and or any kind of like form of resistance, or this idea of this holistic approach. And I'm defaulting my mind to, and I've just finished the book and I've written it and I've talked about in Science of Practice. They talk about having the standard distribution of concentric, eccentric, and isometric no matter what, like a 60-30-10 split. I think about the same thing with sagittal, frontal, transverse. I think about the same thing with like a barbell, dumbbell, kettlebell, med ball, isokinetic, inertial based stuff. I think about what is it relatively speaking to the athlete's goal. Like that ratio shifts and adjusts. So my question to you would be, do you have a system per se of we get closer to preseason, we got to hit more frontal plane, transverse plane stuff. When we get closer to season, we got to hit more isokinetic inertial stuff, or more extensive plyos, or more like this reflexive type of stuff. Like, what is your thought progressing throughout the off season now that you just basically just alluded to? I'm not fixed into I got Olympic lift, I got a power lift, I got to get them this benchmarks of bench squat clean. I can now progress this in a way that's relative to the task, whether it's bioenergetically or biomechanically or even from a force velocity work type perspective. Like, what does that thought process now look like for you?
Yeah, I think we've always kind of had this idea in my head about how to structure and sequence programming. And I learned this from Mike way back in the day, but we look at where do we need them to be, and we kind of work backwards from that standpoint. Like, so when we get to preseason with any sport, we need to be able to perform in the transverse plane, and we need to be able to have a high level of power endurance, meaning that we need to be able to repeat ballistic movements at a high rate of velocity over and over and over again. And so for us to have power endurance, we need to have power subsequently before that. To have power, we need to have strength. Before strength, we need to have some semblance of stability. And so we kind of work backwards. So from a contraction-based standpoint, we tend to do a little bit more isometric work first for that sense and feel to try to improve tissue length, to try to improve any densifications that we may have that built up over the course of the season. Any movement restrictions, we're going to do isometric for work first to try to enhance their ability to get in those movements. And the time and attention by doing eccentric contractions is going to be that much greater than if we're going to do concentric contractions. Then we'll kind of shift into eccentric, where when we do ISOs, the question we ask ourselves is, can we get in the right positions? So that's first and foremost. Then we're going to start to do eccentrics. Now, can we get in and out of that position? Now, can we get in and out of that position with load? Then, can we get in and out of that position repeatedly with speed? So that's kind of like the model that we would work with. So isometrics would tend to be first, then we'll do a phase of eccentrics, then we'll typically do concentrics, and we're just going to surf this force velocity curve where by the end of the off season, we're going to do things at a higher rate of velocity. We are going to do more extensive plyometrics. We are going to do things with a faster tempo, whereas early in the off season where we might want to emphasize maybe some hypertrophy if some athletes might need that, and we'll do some longer time under tension type work as we get closer to the season. We're going to do some shorter base type stuff so we can really try to improve their power outputs as close as, when they need it. Like I've told athletes, like you don't need to be powerful. You don't need to be in great shape in May. So we don't need to do Olympic lifts. So we don't need to do a ton of power-based exercises. So we can probably spend a little bit more time getting stronger at that time. We can spend a little bit more time working on adding a little bit more muscle mass if we can. And then as we get closer to the season, we can shift our goals and shift our perspectives. But that's how we kind of look at things from a perspective of sequencing and progressing athletes to be able to get to where they need to, so we can best prepare them for sport and for competition.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, but distinctly remember early 2000s, maybe late early 2000s, you were one of the big adopters of like Jay Schrader's, Adam Archuleta, functional ISOs, yielding ISOs, very reflexive type of training. It does bring an interesting thought, and it was like the backstory is a lot based off of Marinovich's philosophy too, if I recall correctly. But the thought, and this is something that I think is an interesting point to go in this direction of like, can we improve our function in certain positions and be reflexive and getting more better proprioceptive input? And you talked about it, fascia, just this kind of like proprioceptive organ. You're doing this like what like Schrader would call it pogos in a like deep squat position and just the ball of your foot. You're doing maybe rudiment series. You're doing high rep or low amplitude med ball tosses and throws. You're just developing a more robust nervous system at these lengths and things like that. When we think about fascia and we think about this tissue that's not inert, it's contractile, it's got a lot of proprioceptive nerve endings, a lot of receptor sites on it. When you're looking at your guys throughout the off season and you're thinking about, all right, I'm doing these functional isometrics, I'm doing these, higher amplitude stuff or lower threshold stuff, but I'm just trying to get a feel for it. What is your thought process when you're looking at that person looking coordinated and looking like they're efficient? Because one of the things that I find with a lot of these things is they're more efficient and they need to utilize less mechanical energy. And there's a really good book by Bud Chiringa talking about the difference between male and female weightlifters, and specifically in China, and they were able to like just blow out world records in the last 25, 30 years because they're just way more efficient. And he shows to the point of their facial expression, if it's like tranquility when they're lifting, and they need to be like wearing blankets and heated during in between sets because they get so cool and they're not using their elastic energy as efficiently as they used to, versus the males, like it's extreme aggression, it's mechanical
Interesting.
expenditure, and they're just really inefficient, like, and it can only get so much density in an hour block. And he compares it to this idea of the Fosberg flop of male weightlifters are still doing scissor kicks over a high jump. Female weightlifters are literally Fosberg flopping. They just get to a certain point with the bar and drop, and that's it. They don't care about how high they pull it. They care about how well they can get under it. And they show like is like that. Can they time the oscillation of the bar?
Mm.
Can they bounce at the bottom? Like all these cool things. But I guess my point being is, you're watching or you're doing these things, functional isos, you're doing these extensive plyos, you're doing stuff that's facilitating this stuff. Are you seeing like, is it a fascia thing? Is it a bioenergetic thing? Is it just like a coordination thing? When you're watching your athletes, you're like, yeah, this is working. This is clicking. I like where this is going. Do you have a feel, a vibe for that? Is that just like 20 years of doing this, 20 years plus of doing this, of like, I know what it looks like when it's going good. Like, maybe that's that qualitative aspect you were talking about before. Is that a question? Is that something that you can kind of elaborate on?
I'll try my best, but I think it
Sorry,
is.
it's an awful
I think
question,
it's
but
I think it is something that's evolved over the course of 20 years, and I think it's the evolution of my coaching eye and being able to sense and look at movement just a little bit more effectively. The way I look at movement is really at the feet. Like I am a big proponent of coaching feet and teaching feet and getting athletes to understand how to get grounded from their feet and through their feet and through PRI, and I've really learned that your brain is always trying to search for stability, right? Because your brain, it doesn't know where you are, right? The eyes are, your eyes give information back to your brain of where you are within space, but ultimately your brain is looking for stability. And when it finds stability, sometimes it'll find stability with your eyes. When it finds stability, then it can deliver outputs, right? But if it cannot get instability from the ground because you can't feel your feet, then it's going to go up the chain and try to find stability. So I've found, and I don't know, this is just hypothesis, that I think where, if you've worked with hockey players, when they start to do a lot of dry land training, a lot of them always have shin splints. Why do they have shin splints? Because they're in a hockey boot that's very rigid, that does not move on a 1 inch piece of steel on a surface where the friction is zero. So the inability to feel the ground is going to be that much greater than if you had a dry land athlete or somebody that was in shoes that can really feel the ground. So, and if they can't find stability through their feet, they're going to go up their chain. So it might be their anterior tib, or if you go further up the chain, it might be hips. So I think some sort of like something, hip impingement is a symptom of inability of an athlete's ability to find stability through their feet. The brain is searching to get stability somewhere. So it's going to try to keep going up the chain. And your hips should be a joint that's designed for a lot more mobility rather than stability. So I think that's a reason why that sometimes hip impinge might happen. Similar with shoulder impingement. If you use your hands a lot and you can't feel your hands and you can't get grounded with your hands doing bear crawls and push-ups and things like that, maybe that's going to lead to some shoulder impingement up the chain. Again, just a theory and it's a hypothesis. There's nothing I've read and researched anything like that. Just something that I've noticed and I've found. So going back to the feet. So when we do isometrics and we start with isometrics, coaching the feet is extremely, extremely important. So if you were to do this and you were to do a split squat hold, and I don't know how you coach it, and if you told your athlete to feel the ground, feel your whole foot pushing through the step, you're going to start to notice that your hamstrings will turn on, your posterior hip capsule will turn on that much more effectively than if you just stood in a split squat and just hung out. Then you might feel impingement in your hip. You're going to feel your quad start to burn. But when you start to push and you get stability through your foot, now you can feel the back of your hip capsule. And then what I start to think happens is now your femur is going to be that much more centered within your acetabulum. And now you're going to be that much more effective. And you can see when somebody has a sloppy foot, if they're just there, or if they're actually pushing down and they have an active foot where they're pushing through the ground. So when I notice that they can do those types of things and they have the ability to connect their brain to their body that way, I know when we start to go into a split squat, or if we go into a squat and we go into whatever maybe lower body exercise we have, and I can see that their foot is grounded against the ground and they're understanding how to create leverage and push against the floor, then I know that they're going to be ready. So when we start to do maybe a little bit more pogo jumps and more maybe continuous hurdle hops or any kind of reactive base plyometrics or depth jumps, if that's what they're ready for, they're going to know how to coil and create that almost catapult effect because they know where to create stability, they know where to create rigidity so they can improve that stiffness so that they can produce force at that much higher level. And I think all of that stuff really impacts our fascia. It's what we're really targeting because fascia has three main components, right? It's viscous, right? It's ability to slide and glide against muscle. It's elastic, which is like really training it through the plyometrics, but it also has a lot of plastic properties, which means that it can resist and it can change to whatever, and it can deform to whatever forces are going to be being placed upon it. So I think doing a sequence, um a well thought out sequence of exercises starting with isometrics can really improve an athlete's ability to sense and feel, which in turn, for me as a coach, can better guide them and see if they're producing force and producing movement in the most efficient manner possible. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And a lot of thoughts coming to my head on that. One being, Mike Boyle's line, I don't need to functional movement screen my team. I know what my program is going to be because I base it off of that. But the other part, it's, you're getting to these plyos, you're getting to these outlet or these like big rock things that you want to get with your programming. And you're looking at something as simple as the bottom of a split squat. And if they can't
Mm,
control that position, or if they have poor length tension, poor stability, poor foot proprioceptive awareness, then how am I going to land effectively when I start to increase the threshold or the velocity or just the intensity of anything? So you're getting your diagnostic right there of what their potential is for hurdle jumps. And I see it all the
hmm
time, right? When I'm coaching a squat and person's telling me like I'm not powerful, and they have this like get to that point with that thorax pump handle lifts and the pelvis dumps, and then they just push their butt back.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, when you start to lower yourself down, your only way to handle that range or that position is to take tension off the quad and push
Mm,
your butt back. So if you're trying to get as much vertical force output, when we start to descend to a certain position to get more space or more like movement, your strategy is away from the direction you want to go, and vice versa, probably with horizontal, or vice versa with frontal or transverse. Like,
yes. Yep.
you've lost the ability to maintain that position. So we got to fix this first, and it goes in this whole other idea of fractals, and let's rule out the lowest hanging fruit first. Like, do you have the range? Yes, great. Do you have the stability? Yes, great. Okay. Do you have the control? No. Okay, well, we got to work on that now. And you start to build into, once I get that control, then I'm going to start to add force or velocity or duration and whatever other things go with that. I want to take this home here. And, one of the things that, I'm pulling a lot from this is this idea that, fascia is this thought of, it's ethereal. It's bigger than just like, yeah, just foam roll or do triplanar movement. It's a holistic, it's a philosophy. It's when you see that, you're like, yeah, you are shaped by this bigger narrative of what training is. And you know what your tools are, your weight room to get them strong. You know what your goals are to make your athletes robust and resilient. So what I'm hearing from you is that it's not this like compartmentalized thing that we can look at in isolation and reduce down to just, yeah, it's just fascia, right? And it has a much more cohesive element to it and interconnectedness to it. Like, is that the vibe? Is that the thought process you would want any listener listening to this to kind of take from that?
Yes, and it's challenging because when in school, like, and I don't know who's listening to this, if it's young coaches, older coaches, people that have been around for a while, we're often taught to look at things from a reductionist perspective, right? We look at the cardiovascular system, we learn the muscular system, we learn the endocrine system, we learn the cardiovascular system. Like, we just learn in a systems-based approach, which it's a term that we all kind of use. But I'm going to challenge you to think about this is like, if you get sick, is it, yeah, people are going to say, well, what's your immune system? Well, what happened to my immune system? Maybe it's because I drank last night. Did that affect it? So now my nutrition has gone into it too. Was it my lack of sleep that contributed to my immune system? Was it my inability to control my mental stress that affected my immune system? So you start to look at things from a holistic perspective and understanding that nothing happens in isolation. Nothing happens in isolation. And so if we can look at that perspective from our lives, then we got to look at those things from the way we look at movement, right? Because our bodies are meant to breathe and move, right? That's the thing is, if we really truly value movement, then we're going to start to look at movement from a holistic perspective and understanding what fascia is. It's a sensory organ. It is another system that you should learn about in school that we're learning about right now. It's a sensory system because, like you said before, there's thousands of proprioceptors that are embedded within your fascia. And then you got to start to understand that every time that fascia gets stretched, it's communicating information back to your brain about the joint position, the rate of change, the load that's being placed upon it, and your brain has to coordinate a lot of other proprioceptors, joints, muscles to work together to allow you to coordinate that movement so that you can navigate through your environment, like which we talked about before. So if you value movement, then you got to start to understand what fascia is and what it does and how you can impact it both through outside of just compression work, right? Because a lot of people understand that we can compress fascia, but traction work, like fascial stretching, strength training through full ranges of motions, like that's traction. That's how you can really tension your fascia, and the understanding every time you tension your fascia, you're sending signals back to your brain. Like that, if you can understand that and understand what your brain's job is, it's to direct movement. It's to deliver the right outputs to the right areas so that you can move much more that much more effectively.
Yeah, it's funny when I see, traditional strength conditioning program, and you watch it. Let's say you're coaching there, right? Like, yeah, we're good in the Olympic list, we're good in all these things, and
Mhm.
then, you know what? I'm gonna really get into some of these like big rock kettlebell movements, like a get up or a windmill, and then the first time you do it's a nightmare, right? And you're like, how does this happen, man? Our
Yeah.
guys can hinge with the best of them. You're like, I've neglected that. I've neglected that. I've neglected creating tension in the frontal and transverse
Mm,
plane. I've neglected playing crane length. And I'm not saying do those exercises. Like, do them, don't do them. It doesn't matter. But it's an indicator of what you're not doing. It's you could avoid it as all costs because it's hard and it's a lot of intricacy and there's a lot of things that expose your programming, I guess, just focal point. But on the other end, it's a pretty good tell on just how holistic your program really is. And if it feels like your hip's about to explode, if you feel like your shoulder's cramping and you're shaking uncontrollably when you're doing like a arm bar or a windmill or a get up, it's an opportunity in my mind, and it's a thing to look in and do some introspection on your programming and say, if I ask, eventually I'm gonna have to go in that direction with my hip and my shoulder at a high rate and eccentrically load it.
mm,
Do I have the bandwidth to handle that in a slow, controlled, high constrained environment like a windmill? Now, if I increase the threshold, increase the suddenness, increase the randomness of that, what is my potential to recover from that? And it's probably pretty small. So maybe do those exercises, maybe don't. Maybe get a med ball in there every once in a while. Maybe look at your plyo progressions of like, yeah, I can go up and down. I can go forward and back. Can I go side to side? Can I go rotation a little bit more? Can I look at, okay, if they can back squat 500 pounds, can they lateral squat or single leg squat with control or through a full range of motion or
mm.
without looking like basically their nipples are below their knees on a
They're
lateral
gonna
squat?
crumble, right?
Yeah, it's like yeah, like we're preparing athletes to do things that are really beyond scope or understanding, right? Like we have very little understanding of what's going to happen, and when we look at this short-sighted approach of just get them strong or whatever it is, there's this big tissue all over our body that's saying you're neglecting a huge, huge aspect of this, man. So amazing insight. Honestly, that was awesome, man. And I just got a bunch of books I got to want to dive into, and a lot of cool things that just I don't know. You always did a great job of making me think, and kind of like I always loved your confidence about like, no, I don't do that, like or, no, this is who we are, and I'll be the first to admit like I'm everything's subject to change. So that is something to be applauded and something to be appreciative, and like I think the bigger picture is anyone who's listening to this, young, old, doesn't matter. Like, you're the living embodiment of if you are really good at what you do and you're good at selling it and you believe in what you do and you have confidence, etc. Like, you can make a seemingly small place a big deal. And I think there's a huge insurgence of a lot of like mid-major schools or schools in smaller conferences that you've created a model for. So thank you for that. And I think as a whole, like, just thank you for taking the time, man. This is awesome. So I really appreciate this and everything, every interaction we've ever had, man. So thank you.
I appreciate that, Tim. Thank you for those kind words. And yeah, it's cliche. A lot of people say it all the time that you want to make the big time where you are. And I didn't know I'd be here this long, but it's become home. And if you do a good job, and people notice it, like they're going to continue to invest in you, and they're going to continue to empower you to lead and do what you do at a high level. So I'm appreciative of the opportunities I've been given. But and that in that same sense, a lot of it has come from a lot of self-exploration and can in a never-ending thirst for learning and trying to improve.
Yeah, man. I mean, just shoot. Look at the past 20 years of things that you've acquired since you've been in a position. And it's really easy to rest on your laurels. Like, I would imagine a place like Quinnipiac, not saying it would be exactly like that, but it's not like being at USC where every year you're on the chopping block for someone who's going to come better. But on the other end, it's that reason why you took that proverbial leap into the great unknown of PRI and everything else is why you would be able to probably create what you did. So, great lesson for everybody, man. Like, you're never as good as you should be, and you can always do more, and you can always do better. And if you have a good job, make it great, because like, it shouldn't be taken for granted, man. So, thank you again, man. I honestly just appreciate everything, man. So, we'll get this up here extremely quickly, and I'll have all the things that is Brijesh Patel out there to the world. So, if you like this a little bit, you should definitely dive deeper in everything B's got, because it's just scratching the surface. So, amazing stuff, man. Really, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
All right, brother.